that real recognition of how amazing and really magical, maybe even mystical, the process is. And I think anyone who is a maker or creative person knows that.
That is something I love so much about dialogue, is when you as the reader are privy to something that the characters are not.
And we're constantly in this process, whether we know it or not, of translating it into some sort of, way of understanding a narrative for ourselves and for others.
Hello, I'm Carmel Michael, and this is Hyacinth Podcast. Welcome to part 2 of Writing Life, How Stories Make and Break Us. In part 1, we heard from scholar and writer Jessie Thistle, community organizer Masuma Khan, and fashion influencer Musemo Handahu. In this section, I share my interviews with Scotiabank Giller Prize-winning writer Johanna Skibsrud, celebrated author Carol Bruno, and debut novelist Nicola Davison. We will return to some of the important ideas we explored in part 1 about the kinds of narratives that persist in institutions and systems of power, and how storytelling can build kinship outside of and despite those structures. And for all my fellow writers out there, we'll hear some writing advice and writerly commiseration, because writing is hard. Now, as much as I love digital spaces and new media, I am podcasting here, my first love has always been books. So I'm excited to return to the novel in these interviews. First up, Johanna Skibsrud. In 2010, she won the prestigious Giller Prize for her first book, The Sentimentalists. And since then, she has been publishing fiction, poetry, and essay collections at an impressive rate. Her work is complex, her writing somehow lush in the spaces it leaves. I'm a fan. I first met Johanna at the 2013 Cabot Trail Writers Festival in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, where I was asked, alongside composer Otis Thomas, to write songs based on books. That is a dream gig for a book nerd musician like me. I chose Johanna's debut, The Sentimentalists, as one of my inspirations and wrote a song called Little Sky. Tidbit: I decided to revisit that song to create the music for this episode. I rewrote it a bit, but the basic idea I can thank Johanna for. Needless to say, I was delighted to meet Johanna again at this year's Kingston Writers Festival to talk about her new novel, Island.
My name is Johanna Skibsrud. I'm a writer. I write fiction and poetry, recently nonfiction. I have a book of essays out with Book Thug this fall. And I'm also a teacher. I teach poetry, fiction, and poetics at the University of Arizona.
This story follows the lives of two women over the course of a single day on an imaginary island that is about to burst into revolution. But it's much more than it seems at first glance. The inspiration for this novel comes from a very surprising source, and it takes on some highly relevant global political issues.
So in 2009, I read an article in the New York Times Review of Books, and it was, a review of a really fascinating, important book about Black sites all over the world, sort of floating prisons. And it quoted a military expert as saying that by 2015, so this was in 2009, by 2015, the U.S. hoped to run the entire planet from Diego Garcia, which is a tiny militarized island in the Indian Ocean that has been, many years ago, completely depopulated. And I, was fascinated by this dark history that is sort of very present in that prophecy. When I started the book, it was 2014. So, the sort of idea had been percolating while I was working on a very different novel, I think, in a lot of ways, like a lot of the same themes are addressed. But what I wanted to do was write a story with a real definitive arc, climax, resolution, all of that. So I gave myself several constraints with this novel, and one of them is Island. It is, takes place on an island, a very small geographical location. It takes place in 24 hours, and there's two main characters. And so, this is a sort of like narrative framework that I set up, but at the root of it was really me trying to get my head around this strange kind of sort of continuity of and also reversal of the expansionist, colonial projects of the last, several centuries, in the statement that maybe the U.S. could and does run the entire world from Diego Garcia. So Heart of Darkness, comes in as sort of a haunt or a thread in the novel. So I was like kind of playing with this reversed sort of expansionist model where instead of, okay, we're going to amass as much territory as possible. No, we're going to have as much power, certainly, as possible, just like in the old days. But now we're going to do it by holding as little territory as possible and by being as invisible as possible. So Conrad, as a young boy, sort of fascinated by the blank spaces on the map and sort of questing after the blank spaces on the map. And what I was sort of fascinated with was thinking about what those blank spaces are now, and then realizing, that in my estimation, those blank spaces are kind of all around us, that we're really sort of blind, I think, in a lot of ways, to the sort of link between our everyday realities and the things that make our everyday realities possible, how those are still connected with material histories, with bodies, with labor, and with that very dark history of colonialism as well.
You're obviously exploring themes that are very real and very relevant. What was involved in your decision to make it an imaginary place? How did that help the story?
I really wanted to explore place. And like I was just saying, the sort of the real sort of material foundations of a lot of the things that we don't see or take for granted. To do that, I felt like I had to create this fictional place that was able to take on the ways in which our notions of place are tied very deeply into the reality of place. So Island isn't a place in a way. So it's a place that has been very consciously reconstructed. The island itself was destroyed, or it was depopulated in the 1960s during nuclear testing. So that I borrow from the history of the Marshall Islands. So there's this nuclear legacy. There's a strand from the story of Diego Garcia, which was depopulated. So I really wanted to think about a variety of different experiences with place, the complication of belonging to any place, of returning to place, of constructing place, of belonging to place. Also, none of my characters on my imaginary island, are native. They have all of their histories are very much tied up with colonial history of this island. They've all been brought there at various points of the island's history with one industry or the other. So their relationship to this island was initially created through capital, through labor system.
Another major theme in the book that you play a lot with is time. You have the hourglass image that is written in blood. You have the town clock. You have these two characters who are each sort of experiencing time differently. Rachel is like counting down the hours until she can leave the island. And is it Lota? Lota. She has all these experiences where time kind of expands and contracts.
We may sort of experience time in the present and imagine it as happening now. But the past is, intimately connected, of course, to what's happening now and the future as well. So there's this sort of imminence, and also as a way of sort of disrupting, teasing apart the sort of progress narrative, a linear progress narrative of colonial history, which really I think is a pretty brief period of time in our human history that sort of linear progress narrative has been so dominant. Another aspect of my imaginary island and drawing people from all over the world. There's immigrants and folks that have come from all over the world to make this island their home. And they brought them with them their traditions and their cultures and their stories. And those have meshed and melded together in various strange ways. But a lot of, what that gave me was a way to think about how so many cultures, the world over, northern and southern hemisphere, east and west, for many, many, many years, do have, there are sort of cultural traditions and our stories and our traditions, really reach back beyond. It's hard to even think of language to get away from that sort of linear thinking, but into a sort of nonlinear storytelling mode.
Right. There is one point in the book where you say, what was there in the end but stories, right? One of the characters, or I think that the narrative says that. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the role of storytelling then. I kind of want to start with the role of storytelling in your life. Can you think of a sort of like, what is your early memory of encounter with storytelling? Like, was there someone in your family who was like the storyteller, or did you have a really early relationship with books? Where does this kind of storyteller in you come from?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because we're speaking in Kingston, Ontario, so I was born in Nova Scotia, but from the time I was 1 to 11, and then when I was 11, we moved back to Nova Scotia, but I spent that time in Kingston.
Oh, amazing.
And I was the poster child for Kingston literacy. And when I was 7 years old, literally, there's a picture of me holding a book, and it said, the poster said, "Read to me." And because my mother worked for Kingston Literacy for many years.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's how I wound up on the buses, a poster on buses riding around Kingston in the 1980s.
That is an incredible full circle moment. So now you're sitting in Kingston at the Writers Festival being interviewed as an author.
Right,
That's amazing.
Yeah, so it works. You read to your children and they will love books. And that's what happened, definitely. I mean, my mother was greatly passionate about reading, about literature, about how important that was, to bring families together for, families' health and success and happiness. So so reading was always really important to our family, and books were always around me. I remember also, I think the other sort of aspect of that and having my mother as my mother was that, then it's no big surprise to say that when I, announced at a very young age, like 5, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up, she didn't bat an eye and said, okay, of course you are, go ahead, and I think that now I realize what an absolute privilege that was.
One of the beautiful powers of storytelling and books, I guess literature, is its ability to take us outside of our own life, right? To kind of expand our perception of what is like reality. I guess I'd like to just know a bit more about how you were able to take something that is so politically charged, and it's very structural, right? You're looking at these like historical oppressive structures in the world. But at the same time, you play with these philosophical, almost existential themes of how we experience and see and perceive reality. So maybe we could just talk a little bit more about this, how you pull in these very human, I think, existential ideas into this very, as you said before, structured piece of work.
Some way of sort of exploring or making room for the sort of strangeness of perception is really important.
Right.
Because I guess for me, I mean, speaking of, I think that literature does, it allows us to get outside of our own, limited points of view. And that's its true gift. But always, of course, as the author is bringing, his or her own perspective. And that's always been part of mine, is just to wonder about, the strangeness of point of view, and to run up against, I think, time and again. And I think this is why, in a way, I am a writer. I mean, one of my collections of short stories is called "This Will Be Difficult to Explain," and I think that title is really kind of at the core of everything I do, in a way of just like, okay, so we have all of these, incredibly rich and complex experiences every day, and we're constantly in this process, whether we know it or not, of translating it into some sort of way of understanding a narrative for ourselves and for others. But I think very importantly to this book and to everything that I'm thinking about and have been thinking about for a while is also, okay, yes, connection, yes, interweaving, but also blank space, but also what is the point at which one has to recognize, and I think I think we're referencing before, I think it's become increasingly clear how urgently we need to recognize, where our perspective and our narrative stops, where we have to make room for what we don't know, for otherness, for the unknown.
Johanna's imaginary island pulls together many of the same issues we looked at in part 1. What stories hide behind the supposed blank spaces of our world? Island is out now. Finally, let's think about story as a craft. I'll leave you with my interview with 2 authors who have shared not only a love for story, but the actual labor of writing a novel. A few years ago, while Nicola Davison was working on her first book, In the Wake, she won a mentee position in the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia's Alistair MacLeod Writing Mentorship Program. Her mentor was Carol Bruno, a celebrated East Coast writer and the author of 8 books, who was working on a novel herself called A Circle on the Surface. Both books would go on to win awards at the Atlantic Book Awards. Here's my conversation with them at the live podcast event in Halifax last summer about how wonderful it is to share creative kinship and how scary it is to share creative practice.
So thank you for being here tonight. I have to say, it was very interesting to read both of your books in succession because you were a mentor working on In the Wake, and you were writing A Circle on the Surface at the same time. So what do you think you've learned about your own writing by being a mentor?
You are constantly reminded of the value of what you do, because writing is so insular, and when you're squirreling away with your little stories in your room, you kind of forget about the significance of stories. But the fact is, I think we're hardwired to try to make sense of the chaos that is the world, and it is creating narratives that helps us to do that. You kind of can lose sight of that. You can lose sight of how much fun it can be, also how bloody hard it is,
Yeah.
Again, and working with somebody else, it's one thing as a mentor to say, well, that's not quite working, why don't you try this? And you know how much work that's going to involve for the person. Again, it's that real recognition of how amazing and really magical, maybe even mystical, the process is. And I think anyone who is a maker or creative person knows that.
Mm-hmm. So Nicola, that sounds beautiful. It's mystical, it's important. How does it feel to reveal an unfinished work to somebody, to read it critically? Is it mystical and beautiful?
No, it's terrifying. I think I told you when we first met that when we started the mentorship program, I didn't want Carol to see the whole thing, so I wouldn't give it to her right away. I would only give it to her in these little batches, and before I sent it to her, I would go over the whole batch and edit it again, and then send it to her. But I wanted critique, of course, and I had been working on the novel with my writers group for quite a while, so I had read pieces of it to people before, and I kind of knew where the strengths were, but I didn't know as a whole how it would fit together, and I just felt it was an enormous mess.
Right.
Which I have learned since we all tend to feel about our first draft, second draft, and so on.
So there's something very vulnerable, obviously, about revealing something you're still working on. But what was it like to have someone who had already worked on many novels to sort of be guiding you through the process? Did you ever feel that you were being pushed into a place that you wouldn't have pushed yourself, in a good way, I mean.
In a good way.
Yeah.
Good way. Yeah.
Were there things that Carol opened up to you, ways of thinking about your story that you didn't see yourself?
Yes, I mean, right away she picked up on pacing in the novel, and that's not something that I really knew how to do. So we talked about that immediately. And then the marital relationship within the novel was immediately a problem, and I think it still is. People still tell me how they feel about Daniel. Everyone's mad at Daniel. Mm-hmm. So Carol picked up on that really quickly. And so I started working on that immediately, trying to flesh out that character. And
it's interesting that in both of your novels, there's a marriage at the core of the story. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I would say a troubled marriage, because all of the relationships are very unspoken and subtle, but they're difficult relationships. I'd like to know, Carol, what story were you trying to tell about the female experience in a traditional family structure in your book?
I think in most fiction by women, we're dealing with challenging those roles and looking at them and picking them apart and thinking, you know, and that novel is set in the 1940s when things were even worse, although some things haven't changed that much. But, you know, and sort of exploring the problems of that particular character, Una, who is a school teacher, and in those days, married women were not allowed to teach in the classroom, and you think, oh, what? But that influenced a lot of people's lives greatly, and so that was kind of her main problem, and I sort of took it from there.
Mm-hmm. And Nicola, similar to in your novel, a lot of the narrative, a lot of the story actually occurs in what the characters don't say to each other. Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little bit about the challenge of writing a story in what is unsaid between characters.
that is something I love so much about dialogue, is when you as the reader are privy to something that the characters are not. And so a lot of that came out in editing. So some of those cues may have been there in the initial drafts, but the more editing the book went through, the more I took that out and basically give the reader credit that they can understand that other layer.
Mm-hmm. You're also a photographer. So how did that influence your ability to tell stories without people actually talking to each other? At least not saying what they really mean ever, basically, in your book.
Yeah. Well, as a photographer, my favorite thing to do is to tell stories with images. And so that often means that if I was here tonight and I wasn't sitting here talking to you, I'd be behind that plant over there with my camera, watching all of your faces and anticipating when you're going to laugh and what's going to make you frown and so on. So I do the same thing in my imagination in the room with the characters. I will often act it out when I'm sitting in the chair writing. I'll think, well, how would I physically express that?
Oh, that's always the hard part.
It is, but the editing, you're right. I mean, that's how I got my dialogue too, because again, it's stripping it down so that there's nothing extraneous, and it's really hard to do to get the nuances of how characters are relating to one another, but it's editing, yeah.
But you're also dealing with characters who are dealing with depression, postpartum depression, and mental illness of various kinds in your books. So talk to me a little bit about what informed your ability to write those characters and how you approach something as complex as that, and being able to be compassionate to those characters, understand what's happening, and still communicate that to us as a reader. It seems like a really complicated balance.
My character suffers from tremendous isolation because in the community where she finds herself, she is very much the other. You know, again, she's a white middle-class woman, and so she doesn't really know extremely what it is like to be other. But she comes from a privileged background, and then the village she lives in is not so. It's, you know, pretty rustic. And it's her isolation that you can kind of see how when anyone is isolated and treated as other, how depressing that becomes for a person. And so it was kind of taking her situation and all of these social pressures that kind of conspire against her, really, and then what happens? How does somebody resist? And she does resist in her own way, but it's too hard, and so she really succumbs.
Right.
And that's what it is, and in those days, again, her options are very limited. So she thinks, I'll have a child, and she doesn't really want to be a mother, but she doesn't have any other things she thinks she can do in this scenario. So once she does become a mother, it's really not good. It's really not good, and it becomes even more isolating for her.
Right, and I think that's similar with your main character, Emily. There is a kind of isolation from her family. Something I find interesting about both your books is at the center there are female friendships. You have Linda and Emily, and you have Kit and Una in your book that seem to sort of understand each other in a different way than some of the other characters. How does that work in and outside of the novel? As mentor and mentee, how did that kind of help you with your writing? And in the novels, how do you think the characters use those female friendships?
Well, for my characters, because I've got one of my main characters, Emily, has had a history of depression, and then later on with postpartum depression. And then living next door is Linda, whose son is suffering with mental illness. So right away, Linda and Emily have that connection, understanding that people aren't always accepting of mental illness, and open discussion about it. So I think that kind of gives Emily and Linda that immediate bond where they can talk to one another about it. Are you talking as well about this sort of interplay with Carol and I, both of us having, our own female friendship, talking about our characters? Yeah.
I think, certainly I think it made it easy because there's sort of this understanding between women friends. There's this understanding that we just know, and it's almost things are telescoped. You don't have to really go into it because it's like, oh yeah, we get, like that Daniel, he's just being an ass, right?
Yeah. There's a shorthand with women, I think.
Yeah, there is a shorthand, exactly. So I think that there was, automatically, for me anyway, we had this understanding.
Yeah, and maybe your position as a mentor kind of makes you a bit of an ideal reader, I would think.
Yes, probably.
You obviously come with knowledge as a novelist yourself, but you're reading curiously, and you're informed. So let's just kind of think about why novels. There's a lot of ways that we can tell stories today. So Carol, what brought you to novel writing?
I love narrative. I'm sort of a narrative junkie, right? And again, reading novels is what I love. I also love short stories, and I love writing short stories, but novels, there's something about working on them. Once you finally get into it, it's like being in this little universe that, not that you're in control of it, because you really are not. You're just sort of on the sidelines just trying to take notes, right? But again, there's something, I love the enclosure of working inside a novel.
I really love that image of the novel as a little universe of its own that you get to peek into, and then you tell us about it.
I mean, it's not all pretty either. There's a lot of cursing that comes with that, but it's challenging. It's very challenging, but it's really rewarding too.
Nicola, will you write another book, or did the first one just say that's it?
Oh no, I'm well into book number 3.
Amazing.
And I wrote another one for NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month.
Yeah, that's
so
November.
That's in November. Yeah.
Where you try and write a whole novel in a month. Is that the thing?
Yeah, you have to write 52,000 words in the month of November, and you're not allowed to start until November 1st. So I have that one sitting on a shelf somewhere, gathering dust. I'll get back to that.
So is anybody in for this November? Is anyone brave enough to do it?
No.
Nobody's committing. I see no one committing in the audience. Well, it's been really wonderful to talk to you both, and thank you for being generous with talking about your process, because some people like to protect that a lot because it's scary. Sometimes it feels like if we talk about the things that we do in our creative spaces, it might go away. So I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
This has been Writing Life, How Stories Make and Break Us, Part 2. Do we have all the answers now about the powers, dangers, and absolutely transformative potential of storytelling? I don't think so. But just the practice of conversing with writers, thinkers, and doers across mediums and from various backgrounds. There's something in that. I'm so grateful for the privilege of having these conversations and the great joy of sharing them with you. Be sure to listen to the first half of this episode in part 1 and find me on social media at Hyacinth Podcast to share your feedback and comments. Thanks to all of my guests, Jessie Thistle, Johanna Skibsrud, Masuma Khan, Musemo Handahu, Carol Bruno, and Nicola Davison. Thanks also to the Kingston Writers Festival and the Writers Federation of Nova Scotia. Subscribe to Hyacinth Podcast on your favorite podcast app and never miss an episode. Get details and links to each guest's work at hyacinthpodcast.com or sign up for our email list. I'm Carmel Michael. Thank you for listening, and talk real soon.